Welcome back once again to the world of assassination. Hitman has returned, and we are taking a look at the sequel today. And to discuss it, I am joined by my friend and colleague, Richard Ledbetter. Richard?
Hey John, how's it all going?
It's going pretty good. I've been assassinating targets all day long. Not Sean Bean yet. Hopefully he'll be along soon as one of the special targets. But for now, the target of our discussion today is the multi-platform comparison of Hitman 2 running on across all these different machines, and it's been interesting thus far.
Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated to see the results here because obviously Hitman on the last gen consoles was an intriguing release in that it was virtually identical between Xbox One and PlayStation 4 to the point where we could actually use it as a benchmark to highlight CPU and GPU differences. Pretty much unique on a console game. And then we had the enhanced consoles where IO Interactive essentially used the GPU power to do different things on each machine, and we had that magnificent native 4K Xbox One X version. But this is interesting because it's the next step for the Glacier engine. So what's the story there?
So yeah, I'm also focusing on this more in detail on the other video that's going up alongside this. But to put it simply, the main things I've noticed here is massively improved lighting and reflections. This is the most important one, actually. The reflections in particular really impressed me. So with all the talk about ray tracing and all that, we've been thinking a lot about, okay, real-time reflections. Most games this generation rely on screen space reflections, which means, when the source for the reflection is occluded from view, you lose that information and it no longer reflects, and they usually fall back on like a cube map. Here, it seems that they're actually using sort of an old school technique, but in a very effective manner. To me, it looks like they're using render to texture, basically, where you have sort of a virtual camera that's capturing the scene to a separate buffer that's then rendered out to that texture that's placed over the surface. But what makes it so interesting here is that it's applied to so many different surfaces, including transparent objects like glass. So like this first area here, like in the mansion, and this is the one I'll go into more detail on how this works later, but basically you can see, like, you're standing here and you can see through to the other side, but you can actually still see the reflection of the room behind you, and you can see 47's reflection. Nothing is called from view, it's all visible. The only caveat there is that in doing this, and it's kind of an expensive thing, they seem to be rendering it at quarter resolution. So like, I pixel counted the Xbox One X, which still has a 4K mode, which I guess kind of spoils what we're going to discuss in a moment. And that reflection comes in at 1080p. So when we talk about resolution, just note that from what I can see, the reflection resolution seems to scale in that way. It's basically quarter res on each platform.
That is absolutely fascinating because in terms of the computational expense, it's kind of almost 3D-like in that two different viewpoints are essentially being rendered.
Yeah, it's an expensive thing. I mean, it's true that you don't get some of the post-processing and shadows and stuff. Like if you're wearing sunglasses in this one stage and you peer into the mirror, his glasses appear clear instead of shaded, so you actually see his eyes, and it just looks kind of weird. But you still get the dynamic lights and the reflections, and the actual scene complexity is comparable. But yeah, it's neat because they actually use this for gameplay as well. I mean, you can peek around corners and see things. Like they set up mirrors and reflective surfaces and spots that is conducive to better reading your environment. And that's the main thing here. So these environments are massive. I mean, that super, super dense. That's what Hitman 2016 was built on, and that's what we see here. They've taken it even further. They've ramped up the detail and just the complexity of the environments. So I think that's where we should talk about the main difference between all the different console versions, and that's resolution.
Okie dokie then. So what's the story there?
Well, okay. First, I want to start on the bottom tier here with the base consoles, or pseudo-base. So I'm talking about Xbox One S versus PlayStation 4. Now, as you recall, and you mentioned there, Hitman 2016 was 1080p when it launched on both Xbox One and PlayStation 4. That's no longer the case here. The Xbox One version is 900p now. But PS4 is still 1080p, and both of them use it looks like sort of an SMAA with a temporal component, so like a T1X or 2X kind of thing going on. So there's a little bit of temporal filtering happening. But yeah, Xbox One definitely takes a noticeable hit here. The combination of the AA with the lower res, it just kind of looks fuzzy and blurry, especially playing on my 4K TV here.
And what about the reflections on it, on both consoles? Because if they're quarter res...
Exactly. So I guess that would effectively make, like, say, Xbox One is like 800 by 450 or so. And I actually need to pixel count it, but you can kind of pixel count this right on the TV because the pixel chunks are huge, as you can see here. It does not look great. And in fact, the reflections themselves seem slightly less detailed as well. Like, that's clearly one of the things that sort of doesn't work as well on these on the older consoles. So that's interesting.
But it still holds up. All of the features are there, right?
Yeah, that's the main thing, is all the features are there. Now, there is a couple minor differences compared to the Pro and X consoles, which we'll touch on in a moment. But first, the resolution on those other versions. So PS4 Pro, it's 1440p again, just like Hitman 2016's Pro patch. You still have the option to uncap the frame rate, which is actually something available on all versions of the game. But yeah, it's 1440. Xbox One X has both modes again, so you can either run with a native 4K or also 1440p, which is called like the performance mode basically. And yeah, they all look basically identical in terms of assets, but there are some subtle differences between the base or lower older machines and the upgraded consoles, and that's mainly in terms of, I noticed some very slight LOD differences, some slight texture differences, and a loss in shadow resolution. And then certain other effects like the reflections and depth of field are also tied to the base resolution as well, and those differ between them all. But aside from that, as you can see here, it looks roughly the same, I'd say, between them all, which is to say it looks pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty good turnout overall, but it does look as though the enhanced consoles are the place to play this game based on just the image quality.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those games that has sort of that super clean, crisp look. It's almost like, I've always described it as kind of a PC look in a way, which is kind of a weird thing to say, I suppose. But there's a lot of high frequency detail, a lot of high texture detail, and it's very sharp. And yeah, on the older consoles, especially on the Xbox One S, it doesn't look that great. The texture detail in particular really takes a hit. Like this little bit here, if you look at the wall, compared to X versus Xbox One S, yeah, it's big difference.
So just to be clear here, the X has got selectable resolutions, 1440p and 4K, and Pro is locked to 1440p. So in this case, it's a rerun of the first game.
That's exactly right. Same thing as we saw in the first game.
But not like the first game is performance.
Okay, so yeah, the frame rate is an interesting thing. Let's start with the Pro and Xbox One X. So like Hitman 2016, you can cap or uncap the frame rate, though there is a caveat to that on Xbox One X. So if you choose what amounts to the performance mode on Xbox One X, the game basically runs at an uncapped frame rate. You cannot cap it in this mode. If you switch to native 4K, you can. But this is what's really interesting then, is if you compare this with what we were seeing on the Pro then, both versions are targeting 60 FPS, but the Xbox One X actually comes rather close to reaching this level of performance, and in fact, the gap between the two, when they're both running at 1440p, is kind of massive actually. It's running way better on Xbox One X in this mode. So unfortunately, it's really not perfect in either mode. The X does get pretty close in a lot of scenes to locking at 60, and it does play really well in this mode, but you're still going to get some dips, just like we saw in the 2016 game. On the Pro, though, I think the performance in this mode is low enough where it doesn't really feel all that good to use. It just kind of hangs between 40 and 50 most of the time, sometimes even lower. So it's not the way I'd prefer to play, which is where the cap comes in, and this is where things kind of flip. So as I said, you can't enable the 30 FPS cap in 1440p mode on the X. That's only reserved for the 4K mode. And that's where we have some issues. So When they're both capped at 30 FPS, the Pro delivers a much more stable experience overall. And that kind of makes sense since obviously the resolution is a lot lower on the Pro, right? So it makes sense. But on Xbox One X, the system just can't seem to quite lock to 30 in a lot of scenes. Like it's mostly there, but there's enough slowdown that kind of popped up during scenes that I was surprised. Like early on in the scene here, for instance, you're just walking along. Every time the camera dips down into the grass here, the frame rate drops. And it gets kind of worse when AI shows up later in this stage. Same deal here when we jump over to the level here in sort of suburbia. The entire time, the Xbox One X just can't seem to hold 30 FPS. And so this entire mission is pretty unstable when playing on the X with the 30 FPS cap at native 4K. While the Pro has absolutely no troubles. It's a very stable experience on the Pro. So it's kind of split then. If you want a higher frame rate, obviously you're going to get that on Xbox One X. But if you'd rather have stability and cap it at 30 FPS, the X just can't quite get there because I do think native 4K is maybe just a little bit out of reach for this. And so this is a game where I would have liked to see a dynamic resolution option in there. I think that would hopefully clean up a lot of the situations, but I'm not sure that Glacier 2 supports it. Alternatively, maybe the option to simply cap the frame rate at 1440p would be nice for those that really want stability. And one final little thing just for fun, here's how PS4 Pro stacks up against Xbox One X when the 4K mode on X is uncapped. Just kind of gives you a better idea about, the performance difference between them when the resolution is also so different.
Right, okay. Now, if we go back to the first Hitman on the enhanced consoles, again, you had the option to unlock performance.
That's right.
And the Pro was faster at 1440p than the X was at 4K, if memory serves. But I think the difference this time is that the X dips under 30, whereas in the first game it didn't.
Actually, that's not entirely true. The first game, if you look back at my FPS analysis, there are a couple spots on X where you could dip just below 30 FPS. It was very rare, but it was possible.
Right. Okay.
So
but it was the exception rather than the rule.
Exactly. It was the exception rather than the rule. So by and large, it was awesome at native 4K on the X. This time, the slowdown is a lot more common, and that is the problem I have with it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how does the base consoles factor into the equation then?
Okay, so the pseudo-base console, I guess the Xbox One S, actually, dropping it to 900p does at least seem to tackle the performance issues that could have arisen and that we saw in the first game at points. It's a very stable 30 FPS as well. I did notice a couple little minor drops here and there in certain scenes, but overall the performance does hold to the 30 FPS cap. So if we bring in the PS4 then, it's pretty much the same thing. It's still 30 FPS, and I wasn't really able to find any dips outside of occasional single frame drops here and there. It's very, very stable, and so whether you're playing on base PS4 or Xbox One S, and presumably on the base Xbox One as well, it's looking like a stable 30 FPS. Now, of course, you can uncap the frame rate, and this is a little interesting between these two, and it's similar to what we saw with Hitman 2016. In areas that place more of a demand on the GPU, like this beach, for instance, the Pro has a significant advantage over the Xbox One. Well, maybe not significant, but it's a small sort of advantage. The frames, it's faster on average. But if we jump into a crowded scene like the Miami racetrack, here instead, they turn in almost equal performance in general, I'd say, and this is more likely a CPU limited area, I'd say. Well, probably a mix of CPU and GPU, perhaps. Unlike the previous game, though, where, they were both the same resolution at launch, dropping to 900p here probably helps Xbox One hold on closer to matching the PS4 level of performance. But, I definitely prefer to play in the capped 30 FPS mode here because this is just too unstable for my tastes. I will say that one thing I did notice across all versions is that there is definitely some sort of noticeable input latency with camera and character motion. It's a very slow game, so it's not a huge deal, but something about the way the engine renders, I haven't done the tests, but I suspect we're quite a bit over 100 milliseconds here. Definitely something you will feel. But again, because there's not a lot of high precision shooting or like high speed action, it's not really a big deal, I'd say. And it does, of course, feel a little bit more responsive if you uncap the frame rate, which is something to keep in mind here. But yeah, that's pretty much what we're looking at in terms of performance overall. And, well, that's pretty much the console version. I mean, the only question mark left for me right now is the PC version, which I have not had a chance to look at yet myself. And the big thing there, I guess, would be support for the new GeForce cards. We know that DLSS is supported, but I'm curious if RTX will make its way in there.
Yeah, this is going to be interesting because we did actually spy the game out of the corner of our eye during the presentation behind the scenes, and now I'm kind of wondering, was it actually ray tracing, or were we just seeing these fantastic mirror effects?
That was actually my thought as well. At the time, we saw all those real-time reflections in the demo. I was like, oh, that's got to be real ray trace reflections, but now that I've played it, it's like, maybe that wasn't. And so, that's another point. People are going to be like, hey, you can just do these reflections without ray tracing then. Well, that's not exactly true. I mean, the render to texture feature, it's only applied to select surfaces. I mean, they do use it in a high volume for this type of game, but it's not applied to everything like you would get with the ray traced reflections that we saw, like, say, in Battlefield 5, for instance. So it's not as robust an implementation, but in terms of what you visually see, it is actually quite comparable. It looks really impressive.
And the other thing to bear in mind, it's similar to when a developer targets 60 frames per second. Those reflection effects, those mirrors would have been budgeted into the game very, very early on as a key gameplay feature. It's not a value add, it's fundamental to the experience. It's what they wanted to add. So yeah, it would have been planned for the ground up there. So it would have a big computational cost, which would have been factored into the whole design.
Exactly. And the fact that it even works on the base Xbox One, albeit at a very low resolution, it's pretty cool.
Good stuff.
So yeah, I think that about wraps it up for this one. Thanks for joining me, Rich.
No problem at all. It's been fascinating.
Yes, and for everyone still watching, thanks for watching to the end of the video, and if you did enjoy it, be sure to hit the like button, ring the notification bell up there at the top, follow us both over on Twitter, and yeah, I guess until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.